people. Maybe that's too much, but I do think just anticipating them.
Yes, I should turn my phone
20 years from now.
Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and thank all of you for being patient while we had a fire alarm here. I think it wasn't just a drill, it was a fire alarm, and you waiting outside and then coming back in. I really appreciate that. My name is Don Wolfensberger, Director of the Congress Project here, and your moderator today. For those of you who are new to the center, and we do have not only in our audience about 40 or 50 people, but we have a live webcast going as well as C-SPAN coverage, so we're getting out to a much larger audience as well. But let me just explain briefly what the Wilson Center is about. We were created by an act of Congress back in 1968 as a living memorial to our 28th President, Woodrow Wilson, who to this date is still the only president to hold a Ph.D. And Wilson, as you may know, before he got into politics, was a teacher. He was a professor of government and history, went on to be president of Princeton, and then ran for governor of New Jersey, where he served for 2 years, and then ran for president in 1912 and served for 2 terms. But Wilson always believed that the scholars and the policymakers would benefit by getting together and talking about current issues of the day, that both would benefit from the other's views. And so it was in that spirit that the Congress created this as a living memorial rather than one more marble statue somewhere. And we have about 800 meetings a year in which we try and to live out that spirit that Wilson had in mind, where we bring together policymakers and scholars, the thinkers and the doers, to talk about current issues. Congress Project was created in 1999 in that very same spirit, where we bring together members of Congress from each party. We bring journalists who cover the Hill as well as scholars who write about the Congress, and we talk about a policy issue and how the politics and the process plays out on that. So that's what we're about. This is the penultimate program in a 2-year series on the theme of policymaking, the media, and public opinion. And we're grateful to Chevron for several years now sponsoring these ongoing seminar series. Today's program, as you know, is entitled, or poses the question, I guess I should say, is Senate reform an oxymoron? In my introductory essay for this program, which is in the handout and also available on our website, I recall that when I was studying politics back in the early 1960s, I learned from some of the more liberal academics that were writing books at the time that the 3 horsemen of the Congressional apocalypse were the House Rules Committee, the seniority system, and the filibuster. Well, in the interim, they've taken care of the Rules Committee. It's now, once again, under the arm of the majority leadership, under the finger, whatever you might want to say, of the leadership. The seniority system has changed considerably. Committee chairmen are now basically responsive to their party caucus and their leaders. But the filibuster still remains a bone of contention with many who would like to reform the Senate. And it's not my idea that we are going to spend this entire 2 hours talking about the filibuster, but rather go deeper into the nature of the Senate and its role and how it's changed over time, what still might be done. But all this came to mind back in January of this year when the Senate was undergoing one more debate on whether it should change the Cloture rule. That's Rule 22 that says you need 2/3 vote to stop a filibuster. And at this time it was, I believe the leaders were Senator Tom Udall of New Mexico, Jeff Merkley of Oregon, and Tom Harkin of Iowa. They had about 3 different alternatives to changing the filibuster rule. The bipartisan leadership got together on this occasion, came up with their own gentleman's agreement as an alternative. They took votes on all of them. The reformers, the filibuster reformers, did not get a majority on any of their proposals, but the bipartisan leadership did carry the day with some significant changes on narrowing the number of confirmations or nominations. So the presidential nominations have to be confirmed, of agreeing to have fewer filibusters if the majority did not block minorities' amendments, and so on. So they did some significant things in that process. They also got rid of secret holds, which is a very significant step. We thought we had done that a couple years ago, but members would pass them off to another member before the time expired for them to put their names in the congressional record. But now apparently they have made that foolproof. We'll see. But in any event, the young reformers indicated that they were not parties to this gentleman's agreement necessarily, that they wouldn't hold off for the rest of this Congress, that they might resurrect their reforms if things aren't going well. So we'll see how that works out. We're fortunate today to have with us a very outstanding panel One of the things that I wanted to mention first, though, because this just came to me, I just saw this last week, but in the blurb I wrote for the program, I opened with a sentence that said, the Senate has long been a favorite whipping boy of the media, scholars, and even some senators for its seemingly antiquated and ponderous ways. Little could I have known that the Washington Post's acerbic pundit, Daniel Milbank, would affirm the media critique when he opened his column last Thursday as follows: "In the United States Senate, failure is not an option. It is a requirement." So, with that, let me introduce our panel. What we're going to do is have each of them speak for 15 minutes or so. We give the former senator a little bit more time, but
there'll be a filibuster.
No filibusters, though. Trent Lott, as you know, is a former Republican senator from Mississippi. He's now a senior counsel with the Bro-Lott Leadership Group, but he spent 36 years in the Congress, 16 in the House and 20 in the Senate. During that time, he served in a variety of leadership positions. I won't mention them all, but they include being Republican whip in the House and then going on to the Senate, where he was also the Republican whip and then majority leader. But Trent also served, when he was in the House, on the House Rules Committee, and that's where I was fortunate enough to serve under him as staff counsel for a subcommittee of the House Rules Committee. And that was probably the best 8 years of my 28 in the Congress, because he was a great boss, and we had a lot of fun and got a lot done in the process. After he stepped down as majority leader in the Senate, he was elected chairman of the Senate Rules and Administration Committee, which, among other things, considers reform proposals offered by senators. So he's undoubtedly sat through many hours of hearings on Senate reform there, just as he did as a member of the Joint Committee on the Organization of Congress back in 1993. So you've been through a lot of reform efforts in both bodies over the years. Our second speaker on the panel will be Richard Baker, who is now the Senate Historian Emeritus. Dick served as the Senate's historian since the founding of the Senate History Office, back in 1975 until his retirement in 2009. And that's when the Senate passed a resolution giving him the honorific title of Senate Historian Emeritus. He's author of numerous books and articles on Congress, including a biography of former Senator Clinton Anderson of New Mexico and a bicentennial history of the Senate. But right now he is working on a one-volume history, a larger project of the Senate, and I thought this would be a good time to have him here as sort of a work in progress. And I asked him to give us some ideas, the significant eras in which the Senate has changed, whether it's by conscious reforms or just evolutionary things that happen to change the nature of the Senate. So we're just very delighted to have Dick Baker here for that. Our third speaker will be John Fortier, who is a research fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. John has worked on a variety of projects relating to government and politics. He's author of Second Term Blues, How George W. Bush Has Governed, and another book, After the People Vote, A Guide to the Electoral College, which is very handy, and I do recommend it to people that are very puzzled about this system that we have called the Electoral College, because he really explains it well. He's also served as a principal contributor to the AEI Brookings Election Reform Project and as executive director to the Continuity in Government Commission, which I had a pleasure doing some work with several years ago. I've asked John to give us some background on public attitudes towards Congress in general and the Senate in particular, so we can get some idea of where the public is coming in this piece that we're doing on policy making, the media, and public opinion. I think most would agree that the Senate does pay attention to public opinion and the decisions it makes, both on policy and on internal reform matters, but perhaps more so since it was subject to direct election of the people rather than by state legislatures, slators, back in 1913. And last but not least, I always give our journalists the cleanup batter slot, because they are quite good at synthesizing what has gone before and then giving their perspectives on what they see when they cover the Hill. And we're just very delighted to have back, I think this is the second or third time we've had Janet Hook here, but I first met her back in the 1980s when she was a reporter for the Congressional Quarterly. She went on to work for many years with the Los Angeles Times covering Congress, and the last several years she's been reporting on Congress for the Wall Street Journal. But she's won several journalism awards, including my favorite, because I think it's really one with distinction, the Everett Dirksen Award for Distinguished Reporting on the Congress. I've asked Janet to talk a little bit about how journalists see and report on the Senate, and maybe we can get a little comparison as to how the Senate differs from the House when you're trying to get stories. That will be, I think, very interesting to learn. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Trent Lott. I'll ask each of the speakers to use the podium for their initial presentations, and then during the question period, I will stay at the podium and recognize people for their questions. Trent Lott.
Well, thank you very much, Don. We appreciate the kind introduction, and I'll try to stay within the 15-minute limit because he's already threatened me with a cloture motion, and I'll have to be aware of that. I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson International Center for doing this. I enjoy opportunities like this because I think it's important we have discussions from a panel like this about what the Senate does, what the Congress does, help people understand what really is going on up there sometime, because it looks quite often like it's totally indecipherable and beyond understanding. And I think when you have a discussion like this, maybe you'll pick up on some of the uniqueness of the institutions that we're talking about. And I'm really delighted to be on this panel and be with Don Wolfensberger again. I was pleased that when he was introducing me, he talked about how it was an interesting time that we worked together. We actually had some fun, and I was thinking about that, Don. I remember the famous Phi Slamma Jamma speech you wrote for me. None of you will remember that, but we had a great Michigan basketball team, and I think they won the national championship, and they were referred to as Phi Slamma Jamma, and he wrote a speech for me dealing with some oppression by the majority in the House of Representatives and referred to it as a Phi Slamma Jamma approach. And then, of course, we had the unique rules activities where one time there's a little special thing in the rules where the minority could actually take control of the floor away from the majority in a unique usage of the rules that had only been done like maybe once or twice. So he and I were engineered where we took the control of the floor of the House away from Dick Bowling, Congressman from Missouri. He never forgave me for that, and it was all Don's fault, I might add. And I remember other things like he helped me write one time. I used to, when I was in the Senate, I tried to make the Senate more normal and relaxed, very hard to do. But one of the things we'd do, we had the annual Senate spouses dinner, where the leadership would have a dinner where we honored and recognized our spouses. And I'd have things like Bill Cohen wrote a poem one time, and I had bagpipes one time, and then I actually delivered an ode to Tricia, which was an ode to my wife that Don actually wrote. So I've got lots of memories about Don. And when he was talking about his phrase, the three horsemen of Congressional apocalypse, I was all three. I actually was on the Rules Committee. I came to like seniority once I got it. And I always wanted to be chairman of the Rules Committee, but in the House, not in the Senate, since they have very different rules of what the chairman does or what the committees do in the House versus the Senate. So it's great to be with Don, and I appreciate the service he gave to me and to the country there on the Rules Committee in the House, and that he continues to do great work here. I enjoy reading his articles. And, of course, to be with Richard, a great historian. As the years have gone by, I've become more and more interested in history. In fact, that's about the only thing I read now, other than the obligatory, articles by Janet Hook in the Wall Street Journal, or Roll Call or Politico, the Hill newspapers. But also, Richard and I talked quite a bit about the Senate. He was involved with an effort I had in the Senate called the Leaders Lecture Series, where we brought in former leaders, Republican, Democrat, and talked about what they saw in the Senate and what they would recommend we do. Mike Mansfield was one of those speakers, and he actually delivered a speech that he was going to give the day that John Kennedy was assassinated, never gave, and then he came back and delivered it in the old Senate chamber to the Senate. And when I became majority leader, I hadn't really thought exactly what type of majority leader did I want to be, and I asked for some reading material. You won't remember that, but he recommended some books, and I read, about Lyndon Johnson and Mike Mansfield and Howard Baker and different leadership styles. And always people say, well, which one did you choose? And they're shocked when I say I actually chose Mansfield because I didn't like the aggressive, in-your-face tactics of Lyndon Johnson. And it looked to me like, when you go back and study the numbers, Mansfield got more with sugar and by laissez-faire, in many respects, than Lyndon Johnson did by beating him over the head like he used to do with Hubert Humphrey. And some of you probably read that great book. So it's great to be here with Richard again. And John testified. I always felt like we had not done enough. I still think we've not done enough on the continuity of government issue. John was able to give expert testimony. And Janet, I'll look forward to having the media wrap up as always, because she covered me good, bad, and ugly when I was on the mountaintop and when I was in the valley and when I called back up into the leadership the second time. So I'm delighted to be here. Is Senate reform an oxymoron? You notice the way I said that? An oxymoron. Or as one expert I was talking to earlier today about this event, oxymoronic is the way we called it. Because, I really think that the Senate is what it is, and it's good. Would I make some changes? Yes. Did I try to make some changes? Yes. I was lectured on the floor of the Senate one time, a real tongue lashing by Bob Byrd, Senator Byrd from West Virginia, who was accusing me of trying to make the Senate a mini House. And, of course, he drew on the fact that I had been on the Rules Committee in the House and that I really wanted the Senate Majority Leader, which I was at the time, to become the Rules Committee of the Senate, which is actually not true. I have to warn you in advance that I'm an institutionalist. I guess I have been since I was, a child. But I've always been one that tried to join different organizations, and once you join an organization, you get to know the organization, become actively involved, and then eventually try to be the leader of whatever organization it was, whether it was Key Club in high school or student body in college. But also, my nature is to study the rules. I came to work in Washington in 1968 for the chairman of the Rules Committee, a Democrat from my hometown, Congressman Bill Calmer. I was 26. So early on, I started paying attention to the rules and studying the history of the rules. And one of the things I learned very quickly was that the secret to Southerners' success, particularly the old Democrat chairman, was that they understood the rules. And it was my feeling that he who controls the rules controls the institution. And so I started to really getting involved in the rules and studying the history. And then I became a congressman and went on the Rules Committee my second term and served there, 14 years, moved over to the Senate, and once again found myself being an institutionalist. A lot of the things, somebody asked me the other day, are you for term limits? And I said, well, I was before I was against it. And now I'm thinking about it again. So you can go back and forth. But again, in the Senate, I started studying the rules, and I sat on the back row, not quite ready for prime time, a freshman senator, and I kept trying to figure out, what are the rules here? Is it Robert's Rules of Order? Is it Deschler's Rules of the House? They don't make any sense. So finally I went to parliamentarian of the Senate and said, I don't get it. I got a rules background. What are the rules in the Senate? And he said, there are only two rules in the Senate. What is that? Well, I'm going to get the inside word. He said, exhaustion and unanimous consent. And if you get the senators exhausted enough, they will unanimously agree to anything. And I said, I've got it. And from that point on, including when I became leader, once you ever make up your mind that you're going to make the Senate act, the way to do it is to keep them in on Thursday night, on into Friday morning, on into Friday night if you have to, and occasionally on a Saturday. But you can only bluff them so many times. If you threaten a Saturday session, every now and then you've got to actually do it. So my whole background is one that was interested in rules, interested in the history, and actually believed in understanding and protecting the institutions. Not to say that the House rules or the Senate rules couldn't be improved or changed. Now, I advocated it. I did when I was, Don, I don't know if you were with me then, but I actually was the lead sponsor on the Senate resolution that led to the broadcasting of House floor proceedings. Because Bernie Sist and other Democrats who really were for it didn't want their name on it. And I was such a dummy at the time, I wandered in there and put my name on it. And the House, I really felt like, after all, there was a time in America's history where the American people should see what was going on in the House and in the Senate. Now, you can argue about whether it was a good idea now in retrospect or a bad one, but I think it was the right thing to do. I never liked secret holes. I like holes. I don't like secret holes. I believe absolutely in transparency. Tom Daschle and I tried several times to try to get a grip on secret holds. After all, remember now, the hold is a huge problem for the leader in both parties, because you have these secret holds that would come down out of the rafters and stop a nominee or stop a bill, and quite often the majority leader would be trying to move a bill. And then, not only were they secret, they got what I hated the most, rolling holds, which is once I determined which senator was holding it, and I would go talk to him or her, he would say, "Oh, no, I'm not holding it," and boom, another hold would drop on it. And so I really felt that like there needed to be some reform there. There's no question that the difficulty in getting people to accept nominations to executive positions, and the difficulty you go through, and the confirmation, the length of time, all of that, regardless whether you're Republican or Democrat, is outrageous. And this recent reform that Don referred to, where they took, I think, about a third of the nominees out of the confirmation process, they didn't need to go through that process. And I've always been an advocate, frankly, and I'm sure I'd get in trouble for this, but of saying that nominees had to be moved on some sort of schedule, that you couldn't just hold them up forever without really good cause. And occasionally that does happen. So the Senate reform, it is an oxymoron, and I think when you study the Senate, you think, oh my goodness, it's so hard to move. And then there's the old saying, it's absolutely true. In the Senate, it is easy to stop anything, and it is hard to move anything. It takes real leadership. It takes determination. You have to get engaged. You have to push it hard, but that was the way it was intended, I think. I feel very strongly. I mean, I watched the hot passions of the House, and I watched the lumbering slowness of the Senate, and I think they both serve us quite well. So I guess without going on at great length, there's always some improvements you can make. I thought that the way they handled this reform this year was almost perfect. And some people, some of the reformers made fun of the gentleman's handshake between Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell. Okay, we're going to have fewer cloture petitions. We're going to have fewer filibusters carried out, and also that there would just be some limit on amount of time that would be spent in it, some reasonable limitations. But they did it on a gentleman's handshake. Going back to what I talked about on Mike Mansfield, go back and study the history of the most productive periods in the Senate. And quite often, for instance, in 1996, we were only in session 132 days. And yet, if you study the list of legislation that was passed, it was very historic. Everything from safe drinking water to every appropriations bill. So the point is, if you reward the Senate, if you don't filibuster or you don't fill up the tree, and I was guilty of that, and a lot of these things have gotten worse in recent years. More filibusters, more cloture petitions, more of the leader going in and filling up the tree, which means blocking the other side from offering any amendments. And I did it a few times, but I also remember how my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Tom Daschle, reacted. He'd get mad when I would, I did it to John McCain, too. When John McCain was trying to pass campaign finance reform, he'd say, I'm going to offer this amendment. And I'd say, no, you're not. And he'd say, so I am. I'm going out there right now. I said, go right ahead, but I'll be out there right in front of you, and I'm going to fill up the tree and block you from offering any amendment. And I did, and he did, and we had unpleasantries between each other, and we stayed great friends through it all, because I never surprised him, and I used the rules, and he used the rules. Eventually, he prevailed. After we lost the majority, it went over to the other side, and he got it done. But I think that sort of thing, it does need to be used with discretion and on rarer occasions, because it makes it very hard to get even things that need to be done, because the other side will just go into the nuclear option mode, and you'll get nothing accomplished. But again, the bottom line for me is, having served there, been in the majority, the minority. Tom Daschle and I went back and forth 3 or 4 times, I think, between the majority and the minority. But when I came out the other side of it after 19 years, almost 20 years in the Senate, I felt like it was a pretty good place. One of my last nights in the Senate, I had a long discussion. We were having one of these dopey votoramas. We were voting every 10 or 15 minutes on amendments. We really didn't have any idea what it was, and we would vote like, I don't know how many times, 70, 80 times in a row. So I was standing in the well with John Kyle, I think it was Lindsey Graham, Kent Conrad, Chris Dodd, and Joe Lieberman. And we were talking about how stupid we looked doing these vote-a-ramas. And what was wrong? What was the problem? Was it the rules of the institution? Was it the institution itself? And we were talking about all that. And I said, no, it's not the rules. And it's not the institution. The rules could be changed, by the way, to stop these vote-a-ramas, which they should do. I said, no, the problem is us. We're the problem. It's the leaders in the Senate. We're not leading. When we get tired of this sort of thing happening, and we feel like it's gotten out of control or something needs to be done to change the rules a little bit, we're the ones that can solve the problem. And I also said that I believe the problem is our generation. All of us were about the same age. We were in the mid-60s. We were there, kind of came, a political life in the 60s and 70s and 80s. All of us had served in the House, I think, but Lindsey Graham. And we came to the Senate as partisan warriors. Every day we got up thinking, how can I beat that much? And I think that the next generation won't be quite that much that way. I think they will be a little less partisan in the way they fight every day, and a little more willing to reach across the aisle and make the place a more livable place. So that's the good news about the future of the Senate and reforms that may or may not take place. Thank you, Don. Thank you.
All right. Dick Baker.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, Don, for that nice introduction. I'm glad to be here, and I've tried to live up to my charter by starting with a gentleman named Edward Everett Hale, who some of you may know was a liberal clergyman, a historian, and a social reformer who served as United States Senate chaplain in the first decade of the 20th century. A popular lecturer, he was frequently asked by his audiences what he actually did in the Senate. Do you pray for the senators, Dr. Hale? No, he carefully responded. I look at the senators and I pray for the country. In the same vein, Will Rogers once said, after I read that ancient Rome had a Senate too, I knew then why it had declined. So observers and senators also have dined out on such stories at the Senate's expense ever since the days of George Washington. Common to this humor is the slow-moving Senate's perceived need for reform, even as far back as the very first Congress in 1789, when all sessions were conducted behind closed doors. Those who elected those senators complained loudly, "We elect those people, but we can't see what the heck they're doing." Direct quote. What the heck they're up to. Occasionally, members of the House of Representatives, in a spirit of helpfulness, I'm sure, have proposed reform solutions. Representative Victor Berger offered a constitutional amendment in 1911. Its preamble started, whereas the Senate, in particular, has become an obstructive and useless body, a menace to the liberties of the people, and an obstacle to societal growth. And that was sort of set the tune for the rest of his amendment. His resolution concluded with a provision simply to abolish the Senate, and it had some supporters. Historically, the pressure for Senate reform comes from the outside and in particular from newly elected members who campaigned on a pledge to come to Washington to fix the Senate. But of course, as Senator Lott suggested, by the time those newly elected reformers gain the seniority necessary to seriously advance their proposals, some of them begin to doubt whether they really were actually needed as reform proposals. As with other complex institutions, reform comes to the Senate sporadically, partially, and with results that generally disappoint its most fervent advocates. There are some Senate reform goals that will never be met. The most evident, of course, is the deliberate malapportionment that gives disproportionate power to the smaller states. By fiat of the Supreme Court, this could not happen in state legislatures, only in the United States Senate. That one, giving disproportionate power to the small states, is hardwired in the Constitution. It will never be changed. It's there forever. Then there is the deeply entrenched tradition of virtually unlimited debate. and as we have recently been reminded, further reform there is unlikely anytime soon. I've been asked to mention a few historical examples in which the institution really did undergo substantial change, whether by design or inadvertence. Adoption of the first Cloture rule in 1917 emphatically is not on my list. That was merely a shrewd move, in my opinion, executed under great public pressure to diffuse citizens' anger by setting up an impractical mechanism for cutting off debate. It required the nearly unattainable two-thirds majority and permitted that each of the 96 senators then serving had the opportunity and the option to speak for 1 hour each after cloture had been evoked. For the next half century after 1917, that Rule 22 had very little impact. Here, then, are my three arbitrarily selected historical examples of major Senate reform achievements. They come from the years 1911, 1946, and the period from 1975 to 1986. As a historian, I kind of back off after 1986. We have too many good close observers of that period yet to come. The one major flaw in the Constitution related to the Senate was its provision that senators be elected by state legislatures. And, of course, there are some editorial writers today who don't think that was a flaw at all, that it ought to come back. But that particular provision quickly became a breeding ground for corruption, bribery, and legislative gridlock. In Senator Byrd's History of the Senate, Volume 1, you'll find a very detailed, very richly documented chapter on that particular, to support that point. Right after the Civil War, Congress tried to fix the problem with statutory adjustments, but without enduring success. In the 1890s, the ever-helpful House of Representatives passed a constitutional amendment to provide for the direct popular election of senators, but the Senate was having no part of that. Southern senators in that Jim Crow era wanted to take no chances on having black American citizens control who might be elected to the Senate. By 1910, however, Southern state voting requirements had pretty well removed that threat by disenfranchising all black voters. Yet, in that same year, the 1910 Senate elections brought in a large new class of members committed to adopting a constitutional amendment similar to the one that the popularly elected House had approved. And some of those new senators had previously been House members. With its infusion of new members committed to progressive-era reforms intended to bring the government closer to the people, the Senate quickly adopted that amendment in 1911. Of course, by then, and this is a big of course, substantive change in the manner of electing senators really had been in effect for several decades. In an example of how Senate reform tends to come from the outside, approximately half the states, beginning in the 1880s, had enacted provisions directing their legislatures to abide by the results of senatorial primaries. Agitation for this reform had deep roots, even back to 1789, but the year 1826 saw the first constitutional amendment come before the Senate in an attempt to fix the problem. From 1826, however, it took the still slow-moving Senate another 90 years, that's nearly 90 years, to give its approval to what in 1913 became the Constitution's 17th Amendment. My second historical example is the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1946. The exhibits over in the Capitol Visitor Center are divided into 6 chronological periods. The so-called modern period begins in 1946. Which may tell you something about the age of those of us who were working on the planning for those exhibits. But one of the main reasons for that, for 1946, from the perspective of congressional history, is indeed the 1946 Legislative Reorganization Act, the granddaddy of all congressional reform undertakings. It fundamentally shaped the Congress that we know today. Those reforms came after years of editorializing and public hearings about how Congress, a creation of the late 18th century, needed the up-to-date tools necessary to cope with the challenges of a dangerous mid-20th century world. Yet even to make that reform possible, it took a Second World War and enormous resentment among congressional leaders over how they had been manipulated by an increasingly powerful presidency. The 1946 Act's major legacy lies in the exponential growth of resources available to members to adequately perform their responsibilities. For the first time, members and committees could recruit professional staffs, and they could pay sufficient salaries to ensure that those staffs were at least as competent as those working for the executive branch. My third historical example begins in 1975, another year that would be a good candidate for heralding the start of the modern Congress. It was deeply influenced by the extensive congressional reform activity in the 1960s, and there are people here in this room today who were actively involved in that 1960s activity. In 1975, recognizing that it was about to experience a generational change, the Senate established a Blue Ribbon Commission on the operation of the Senate, followed a year later by its special committee to examine the Senate committee system. In 1977, as the two Senate floor leadership positions passed from the older Mike Mansfield, Hugh Scott generation to the younger hands of Robert Byrd and Howard Baker, some of the recommendations offered by these study panels were ready for implementation. They inspired three notable changes over the following decade. The first change came in 1975 under Senate Resolution 60, SRES 60. And I asked Senate staff members if they've ever heard of SRES 60, and most of them look at me like they're really, from a different era, which I am. But this resolution was implemented to allow all committee members, not just the chair, not just the ranking minority member, to select their support staff, a revolutionary change that pretty much is taken for granted today. The second change relates to an effort to define proper ethical standards for senators. The Senate first began work on a code of conduct for its members in 1959. In 1964, following some serious scandals related to abuses of campaign financing, it established its Select Committee on Standards and Conduct. In 1977, as part of this institutional reform surge, the Senate further strengthened its rules governing financial activities of senators and upgraded that committee to become today's Select Committee on Ethics. Now, senators and staff are allowed to accept food from outside interests, so long as they consume it with a toothpick and are standing up. That's where we are on that reform. And finally, my final example of the culmination of a long campaign to bring change to the Senate is the initiation in 1986 of gavel-to-gavel television coverage of Senate floor proceedings. It took many years to accomplish that objective, certainly a vast change from the closed-door Senate of 1789. And as was suggested earlier in this panel, you won't get unanimous agreement that it's working quite the way that its strongest advocates had hoped, but it certainly is there. And I would say that the long road to televising Senate proceedings serves as a prime example of reform Senate style. Reform Senate style, all capitalized. Delayed, incomplete, and not totally satisfying to all, but reform nonetheless. Thank you.
John Fortier.
Thank you, Don, and thank you to the Wilson Center for putting on this wonderful event. Don gave me two missions today. One was to talk about public opinion or the Senate's popularity, and then the other to say something about how President Obama might have benefited from his time in the Senate. As many of you know, at least the direct election of somebody sitting in the Senate to the president is a rare event. So what did the president learn from his time there? On public opinion data, I wish I could tell you that there was a lot specifically on the Senate. It really is not a subject that is asked broadly of the public. There is a lot on Congress, and as many of you know, it's not very pretty today. Last Friday, Gallup had Congress's job approval at 18%, which the president, who's sort of gone up and down a little bit since his election in 2000, since the midterm election in 2010, sits in the mid to high 40s. And I think we've seen a trend in the congressional approval ratings that they've been low, and they've been low for parties that control the Congress. The base of a party often loses confidence in its congressional leadership much earlier than it loses confidence in its president. You saw in 2006 a brief burst after the 2006 election among Democrats saying, look, now Congress is in the right hands. We have a little more confidence in Congress. It's going in the right direction. But that didn't last very long. Now with divided government, both parties find a way to be unhappy with Congress in a way that they're not as unhappy with their presidents. So without that much public opinion data on the Congress, on the Senate itself, I guess I want to say a couple things about changes in attitudes towards the Senate broadly. One mentioning the 17th Amendment, which I'll get to second, and then first, more generally, this question of how the Senate fits into people's worries about getting things done in Washington. That the Senate today is seen as really, by some people, an obstacle to getting things done by a majority. And how this has changed is really that 30 or 40 years ago, there were a number of blocking points that could frustrate a majority. Don mentioned the three horsemen of the apocalypse. I think more generally, you could think of both the party system and the House of Representatives were, at times, not completely majoritarian institutions. Political scientists, my political fellow scientists of the 1940s, issued a manifesto worrying that our political parties were not responsible enough, that we should have a more parliamentary-style government, that if you elected a president and a Congress of one party, they should have a platform. We should know what they stand for. They have the opportunity to put something into place, and then we as voters have something at the next election, a time to say, well, we agree with what you've done, or you have done it well or not done it well, and express our opinion in the next election. What those political scientists and many others felt was that that majority was not being expressed, and that was not simply because of the Senate. Sometimes the Senate was implicated, but the House Rules Committee, the political parties themselves. The Democratic Party in particular was a funny majority party with a large progressive left wing and a small to medium-sized right wing, and there were many cross-party coalitions, and that system, which many railed against, has started to dissipate. And as our parties have become much more clearly ideological and more clearly left and right with different positions, what's left is the Senate, much more exposed as the body because of its supermajority requirements in some cases, as the body that stops dedicated majorities from getting what they want. Clearly, we've seen this in both parties, with 2005, in particular Republicans worrying about Democrats opposing judicial nominees, wanting to stop a president and then a Senate of the same party from putting people into the judicial office that they chose to select. And, of course, we've seen that in the last Congress with the Democratic majority being frustrated by, even when they had the 60 votes, worried that it was really too hard to get what a significant majority across the House, the Senate, and then the presidency wanted to get done. So the Senate is much more exposed as the body that is seen as the one place where democratic wishes and democratic program, not capital D, but small d democratic programs are frustrated. Now, in some ways, I think also the Senate is something of an antidote to our worries about polarization. The political scientists of the 1940s worried about no responsible parties. Today, we hear a lot of lamenting about the polarization, about the strong views and the strong rhetoric on both sides, about the lack of agreement, about the need for some bipartisan cooperation, and sometimes it's very hard to find that. And, of course, the Senate is, I will say, in some ways, the land of gangs. Now, I don't think that Senator Lott will roll up his sleeve and show a gang tattoo on his arm, but you do, in the Senate, have the ability to have small groups of people, often in the middle, groups of Republicans and Democrats, coming together sometimes not with the blessing of their leaders, but finding ways to come to agreements. I think of the Gang of 14, referring back to 2005, when there was a group that on both sides of the aisle worked on lessening the Senate filibusters of judicial nominees, and also agreed not to make the large changes in rules which the majority or some of the majority were proposing. I think today of the Gang of 6, another gang that's just looking at our important fiscal problems. A gang of Republicans and Democrats who, by their place in the middle, might shape what a future compromise is. And so the Senate does have frustrating aspects to it in terms of the ability of a dedicated majority to get its way, but it also has the possibility of reaching across the aisle and allowing larger coalitions to address our larger problems. The 17th Amendment, I have a few things to say about this, and I'm glad Richard mentioned it. The 17th Amendment, interestingly, has come back as a political issue. There were some conservative academics who a few years ago took up the cause, and I think the main argument and the worry on their part was that we are forgetting our federalist roots. We are forgetting about the role of states and too much emphasis on Washington, and perhaps a return to the old system where state legislatures elected senators rather than the people might cause senators to be more concerned about what was going on in their states, that their state legislators cared about, that their home people really cared about. And that has now reached a political issue. I know that in the Senate convention in Utah, Senator Bennett, who ultimately lost, was the only supporter among the candidates on the Republican side who was a supporter of the 17th Amendment. The others all thought that it was not a good thing, that we'd gone too far into Washington and maybe we'd be better off going back to our roots in the states by allowing state legislators to elect those senators. And I guess I'm not for that, and I don't think it's going to spread wildly enough that we're going to have an amendment repealing that. But one thing I will note is, on the democratic character of the Senate, yes, in many ways it has some anti-democratic features, but senators, as popularly elected figures, are better known than their House counterparts. More people could name their senator. More people vote for senators. Senators' elections can drive a larger turnout. And sometimes when there's no senator or governor on the ballot, House turnout in a midterm election can be much lower. And so there's a certain kind of more democratic character to the Senate because of that. And I guess I would ask those who advocate getting rid of the 17th Amendment whether the Senate would really be able to withstand some of the pressure against it if it were undemocratic in that way as well, or at least less directly democratic because they were elected by state legislatures. How many countries around the world have an effective second chamber? Many of them don't have a second chamber at all, and others have a kind of archaic second chamber, one that might block something, or in the case of the House of Lords, has minor powers which, if exercised to their fullest extent, would probably lead to their abolition. So having a second chamber and having the ability to have a different sort of majority reflected, the Senate being popularly elected does give it a kind of greater legitimacy than it might otherwise. Finally, did the president benefit from his time in the Senate? I often get to speak to foreign audiences, and one of my favorite lines I have to amend now because the president has been elected as a senator. And before President Obama was elected, I used to say, well, 4 of our last 5 presidents had never held a job in Washington before they became president. Presidents Reagan, Carter, Clinton, and George W. Bush had all been governors, hadn't really worked in Washington. And how could that be? Could any other country say that? Could your leader of your party, the person who becomes prime minister, could you say that person had really never worked in the capital city? And it's a very uncommon thing, and it's a strong tendency for us to look to governors and look to outsiders in Washington and look to people with executive experience. But the president was elected. He was one of 3 in recent time who came directly from the Senate to the presidency. And I think one thing he did gain by that experience, even only 4 years, was an appreciation for Washington. And I mean that in the good way, that several presidents before, especially his Democratic predecessors, Jimmy Carter, Bill Clinton, really came to Washington without as strong a connection to Washington, as real outsiders. And you saw that reflected in the types of people they picked as their chiefs of staff and how they started to deal with Congress and really how they had a rocky start, especially with their own party in Congress. And I think the president, in many ways, had benefited from his time in the Senate, his closeness with Senator Daschle, the staff that he had hired, and the ability for a young president to really look to some experienced Washington hands, people who are older than him, more experienced than him in key positions. The one area which I think we just want to leave open for future debate and the end of the Obama presidency is thinking about the president's legislative strategy and where he sees the Senate in that realm. The Bush administration was kind of interesting, and I think maybe that fits with today's polarized politics, with the House of Representatives being strongly supportive of the majority. President Bush had the House of Representatives often, in his case, I don't want to say rubber stamp, but certainly pass his agenda with much of it intact. and the Senate was the place where the deal was cut, where the president might have to take 80% or go for some sort of compromise. I think that President Obama, especially on health care and in a couple of other areas, found himself going back and forth between the Senate and the House. Hadn't really secured his program in the House, found that the Senate might disagree, and then the House wanted to kind of renegotiate things. And I think one could imagine in the Senate of today, where the Senate is a tougher hurdle to get past, the presidents might be more likely to follow that Bush model that he used in many cases. The House, the more parliamentary body, is with the president. The Senate, with the supermajority, has a little bit of negotiation, causes the president to trim his sails a bit, and that's where a president might say, I need to make a deal, I need to get to that point, and that's where the final deal will be cut. So on that, I will conclude.
Oh, okay.
Janet Hook.
You know, I'm so short. Would you mind if I sat down? I
Yes,
feel like I'm
you may.
too short for this podium.
I didn't get you the shillelagh stool to stand on.
You know, I'm glad John was commenting on President Obama and his role in the Senate. I actually just got a great window onto what Obama's view of the Senate is right now, because over the weekend, President Obama attended the Gridiron Dinner. It's the annual white tie dinner that the press has, and the president addresses him. And he had a great laugh line about the Senate, which was, he said, you know, the last time I was at this dinner, it was 2006. And a lot has changed in those 5 years. Back then, I was a newcomer who couldn't get anything done in the Senate. And now I'm a president who can't get anything done in the Senate. You know, and he clearly does see it as the Senate was a big obstacle to President Obama advancing his agenda, even when he had lots of more Democrats there. But I have to say, you know, from President Obama to sort of the public opinion polls to, you know, my fellow journalists, there is a lot of kind of Senate bashing, Congress bashing. It's really easy to. Well, no, I won't put it that way. It's very hard to love the Senate as an outsider. It's a very kind of archaic in its ways, incomprehensible. You turn on the TV and it's on C-SPAN and nothing's happening. I mean, it's just really, it's a hard place to understand, let alone love. I have to say, I've covered it long enough that I see these glimpses of people who do love the Senate, like when Chris Dodd retired and he gave his final speech, there's a man who really loved the Senate and could talk about it in a way that really you could feel that he had thought that this was an institution that was capable of great things. And in his final months in the Senate, he actually had a big hand in some of the very ambitious accomplishments of the Senate, which was that he took the lead in writing the healthcare. He had a leading role in writing the healthcare bill and the Wall Street reform bill that went through. But anyway, it being a very complicated and hard to love and understand institution, I have always felt like my role as a congressional correspondent, it's kind of like I'm a foreign correspondent to the rest of the country, to my fellow Americans. This is what's going on, and it's a job that, you know, a lot of people have, you know, asked me, you know, how can you cover Congress for so long? Don't you get kind of tired of it? And I have to say, you know, there are a lot of jobs in journalism that you kind of that are very. I don't know. I guess maybe this is a little streak of self-importance. I just think that understanding Congress is a really important thing, and I feel like it's a service that I can provide, not just, you know, kind of making fun of an awkward institution, but trying to help people understand what they're doing that affects people's lives. Though I have to say, I love the question of this: is Senate reform an oxymoron? Part of the reason why I love it is, you know, in journalism, in daily reporting, where we're supposed to be kind of, you know, right down the middle, we can't use the word reform. Like, we can't talk about Senate reform because it implies that you support what's going on. So is restricting filibusters a Senate reform? Well, only if you think the filibuster's bad. So and all those years that we were writing about tax reform, everybody was talking about tax reform, but we couldn't call it reform because it implied that it was a good change. So we have all these, you know, synonyms that we use, like it's always tax overhaul or revamping the tax code just to try to be value neutral about it all. So, my feeling is when people now currently talk about Senate reform, they're mostly talking about the filibuster and the rules. But I think the question is, can you have Senate reform, or is it an oxymoron? I mean, really all we're talking about is, can the Senate change? For better or worse, that's a value judgment. But the Senate can change. It has changed, and it changes every 2 years quite a lot. The rules change slowly for the reasons that my fellow panelists have laid out pretty well. I mean, part of it's in the Constitution. Part of it's just an institution that loves tradition. And you can bring in all these new members who want to challenge tradition, but they're usually kind of ipso facto outnumbered by the people who've come to love the traditions. And I started my career covering Congress, as Don mentioned, at Congressional Quarterly, which is kind of the trade publication of Capitol Hill. We covered everything that Congress did in minute detail, including the procedural aspects of it. And rules changes generally, I mean, it's really hard to write about them for a general audience because it's kind of inside baseball and it's all very complicated. But having written for CQ, I came to know quite a lot about it, and I was pretty interested in it. But so when I left CQ and worked for the LA Times and then the Wall Street Journal, you just don't get to write about it that much. But this year, really, and in the last 2 years, I would say, Senate procedure got to be a much more interesting political story. I mean, people outside the dome cared about it. And the pressure for the Senate to change, I thought what was most interesting about the last couple of years in the latest round of efforts to change the Senate rules and the criticism of the filibuster is how much it came from outside the Senate, because year after year after year, you can always hear people complaining about the filibuster inside the Senate if you're in the majority and trying to get things done. But as soon as you're in the minority, the senators are much more inclined to like the filibuster. But in the last 2 years, you heard a lot, and it was a reflection of, I think, of a lot of the complaints came from the left and from the Democrats, who were really, really frustrated that in the first 2 years of the Obama administration, here the Democratic Party had commanding majorities in the House and the Senate, and they just couldn't get done what they wanted to get done. And so in many ways, it was almost a function of the fact that Democrats had 60 votes that the filibuster came to be that much more frustrating, because, why can't we do what we wanted to do? So there was this sense of, it was kind of in many ways, I think that the pressure to change the filibuster reduces when you have a narrower majority, because, people, the parties have to work together and form bipartisan coalitions. But as long as Democrats had 60 votes in the Senate and a majority in the House, there was this perception that you could accomplish things with one-party decision-making and proposals. And now that can't happen. But I thought that it was interesting then that the filibuster debate came to a head this year after the Democrats lost their majority. And, it really was a classic case, though, of there being all this head of steam, lots of new members proposing things, and then Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell got together and formed, this is classic Senate, a gentleman's agreement. We don't change the rules, we'll just agree to do what we want to do. And as Don mentioned, or I think it was Don who mentioned it, that the basic agreement was that Mitch McConnell agreed that he wouldn't, the Republicans wouldn't support filibusters on actually just bringing the bills up, and that in exchange Harry Reid would allow more amendments, which it kind of depends on what do you think the problem is with the Senate, whether this solves it or not, because some people think that the problem with the way the Senate works is that things take a really long time. And there are others who think that the problem is that, well, they just don't vote on things, that they filibuster and they just don't get to the vote. And then there are others who don't like the Senate because they don't like what the Senate actually accomplishes. But that's a political, not a procedural decision. So anyway, I'm here to report on the results of the first 2 months of the gentleman's agreement. And it has solved one problem, which is they are voting on a lot of stuff, but it does take a really long time. So, for example, they took up one of the first bills that Harry Reid brought up was what it seemed like a kind of a routine authorization bill. I guess it was a big deal, though, because they hadn't done it in a long time, authorizing the Federal Aviation Administration. Doesn't sound like a big partisan thing. But so he brought it up, and Mitch McConnell the Republicans didn't put up any procedural obstacles, and they voted on it, and it took them 2 weeks. 3 weeks? I don't know. It took a while. You know, I don't know how long Senator Lott would have thought that bill would take, but they allowed a lot of amendments. And to their credit, a lot of the amendments actually had to do with airplanes. Some of them didn't, though. For example, it was during the debate on the FAA bill that the Senate voted for the first time on repealing the health care bill, the health care law. So they got their vote, and it had nothing to do with the FAA, but they got the vote. And they had a couple other kind of off-topic subjects, like I guess they also voted on, repealing the Davis-Bacon, Wage Standards Act, things like that. But for the most part, it was just a lot of amendments about airplanes. So, you could say that that's the Senate working its will the way it was supposed to. But it did take 3 weeks. And then they did a patent reform bill, which was also a big, important bill. And anyway, so there is this sense that the gentleman's agreement is producing debate, vote, amendments, but it doesn't speed things up, if that's what you're interested in. And the interesting comparison is Don was suggesting that I could talk about the difference between covering the House and the Senate. Now, reporters are people, and we do like to get home to our families. So the thing that we really hate about the Senate is when the debates drag on and on and on into the night, and you can never know when they're going to take the vote. And I'm telling you, there's one question that editors have asked me throughout my career that I just got to tell them, I cannot answer this question. The question is, when is the Senate going to blank, do anything? You can never say when the Senate's going to do anything. So I think Senator Lott might have been one of the first leaders to come up with this idea of saying at 6 o'clock we're not going to take any more votes, and that. Anyway, so the biggest difference between the House and Senate is kind of predictability. The House Rules Committee kind of sets a lot of ground rules for a floor debate. You can have X amendments, and you get 1 hour debate on this amendment and 2 hours on that. And the Senate is much more free form and free floating. So there was a little bit of a role reversal, though, when the House recently took up the big continuing resolution, the big spending cut bill. John Boehner made good on his promise to allow an open rule and let everybody offer as many amendments as they want. And they took all week, and they just offered hundreds, I don't know, hundreds of amendments. Did you get the number?
Well, there were
500
about
amendments.
583 filed, yeah.
I knew I was with the experts here. And it was really interesting. I mean, it was a little bit chaotic, but I can't say it was like the vote-a-ramas that Senator Lott was talking about in the Senate, where they just had back-to-back roll call votes. I mean, there was I guess they had them back-to-back. Anyway, so it was just interesting. And what I found there that was really striking is, so long as the House is run with a really rigid structure of the leadership decides which 4 amendments will be voted on, most often they're very partisan votes because they've decided what votes they want. And so, they kind of choose the subjects that will split along party lines. But with this open debate process, there were a lot of partisan votes in the House, but I was surprised there were a lot of really deeply bipartisan votes, which is to say, a bunch of moderate Republicans join up with Democrats, or Tea Party Republicans join with liberal Democrats to kill a defense project or something like that. So it was much more interesting, and you got a much more nuanced reading of the politics of a wider variety of issues. So this all just from the reporter's perspective. I like things that are interesting and important. And so I guess that's kind of why I covered Congress for as long as I have. Anyway, so with that, I think maybe it's time for us to hear questions. Is that?
May I respond to just a couple of things?
On you anyway to follow up on what the others said since you went first.
Well, I thought what Janet was saying was tremendously interesting and relevant to this discussion. You take the FAA bill. I worked on that bill when I was in the Senate in 2007. Same bill. It had been pending since, I think, 2006. They had 17 extensions of the old law because they couldn't come together on, how to move the Federal Aviation Administration, or how to go to the next generation modernization of our air traffic control system. The problem was there had been troublesome amendments embedded in that bill all along. and they couldn't come up with an agreement of how to pull them out. And because they couldn't pull them out, competent senators like Lamar Alexander of Tennessee said, if you bring up this bill, that piece in there, we will filibuster it. And so it had been deadlocked, really, for, I think, 5 years. What finally happened, they said, we need to get this bill done. They went in with a bipartisan group, took out the troublesome, mostly labor amendments, but some other amendments too, took those out, and voila, it passed. Showing, once again, that the Senate, while it's slow and cumbersome, it'll quite often have bad stuff stuck in bills, but the process eventually produces a bill that is a consensus bill. What held it up for 3 weeks, first of all, they had a retreat that some of them had to go to somewhere out of town, but also there was one amendment that was still very troublesome, wasn't a labor amendment, it had to do with perimeter rules, where how many airplanes can fly out of Reagan National across the country. That was the substantive issue that held it up. But in the end, they got a bill that had been hanging around for 5 years, and they finally got it done, probably right. Now, it's probably a shell of itself of what it really should have been, but it still is a very good bill. Same thing with patent. They've been arguing about patent reform for I don't know how long, Janet. How long you been covering it? And finally, and the last time we had it up, I think was 2006. It was a big shootout with the pharmaceutical industry on one side and Silicon Valley on the other side, and they wanted reform but couldn't agree how to do it. Finally, boom. They got it done in a consensus way. Now, the House has still got some problems with it. So that's a couple examples of where it's ugly and it's slow, but it forces them eventually to quit being partisan, pull out the troublesome amendments, and produce a product. And the other thing is on the open rule. Speaker Boehner, I thought it was a brilliant move. First bill up of the year, controversial bill, open rule, go at it, boys and girls, have fun. They had fun. Hopefully that's the last open rule you'll see in the House.
It reminds me of when Newt Gingrich asked his Republican conference whether they wanted a contract with America too, and they all said no. That 100-day death march was enough for them, so it's the same idea. I seem to remember that the issue of how many planes could fly out of Reagan has always been very important to members of Congress for some reason.
I don't know why.
Yeah, because we want to fly out of Reagan, and the local people say, no, you got to fly out of Dulles. So it is always a big shootout. By the way, also, speaking of the old rules guy, one of the little adages I always had was that process is substance, process or procedure. If you don't understand procedure, you're not going to get a bill. If you don't pay attention to process, it doesn't make a difference what the substance is. And so when I was in leadership positions, I used a process clearly to thwart the will of others or to produce a substantive bill I wanted. Process is really important in the House, but even more so in the Senate. And one question that comes out of all this, everybody's advocating change. Does the Senate really need a change? No, I don't think so. I mean, can you find some improvements or, are there some problems? You always can have some of that. The secret is to understand the rules, to understand the institution, and learn how to make them work, not only for you as an individual senator, but for the country. I used to get in trouble with my own party because I became known as a compromiser. Ooh, this is bad. Yes, he'll give and take. Hey, look. This is a legislative process. And if you look up legislation in the dictionary, it should say the art of compromise. When you're dealing with 100 egomaniacs, and I say that affectionately because I was one of them, and at least 98 of them thought they should be president. I don't know who the other one was other than me that didn't think he should be president. But you cannot just say this is the way it's going to be, it's my way or no way. Or the highway, as my partner John Breaux used to say. That's what you'll get. You'll get the highway. You'll get nothing. And so you have to find a way to get to a solution. Do you have to give up your principles and your philosophy? No. But you have to. I always started here on the right of center. And my colleague on the other side of the aisle, who was the majority leader and the minority leader, Democrat Tom Daschle, he was a South Dakota Prairie populist. I was a Southern conservative Republican. So he started here and I started there. And then we started to say, okay, where can we get to a sweet spot that is good enough for you? Maybe sometime if I had the votes, I'd actually go to Tom and say, Tom, is there something we could tweak this where it would make it easier for you to sell it to your conference, so it'll go down easier, so we can get a result. And by the way, one thing you need to notice about the Senate, too, you may think it's slow and ponderous, never moves. When it wants to, it can move like lightning. After 9/11, go back and look at the history of the Patriot Act. A lot of people say, yeah, you move like lightning and you took away individual freedoms, too. But that was a case where Tom Daschle and I talked on the phone. We agreed we needed to get it done. I was talking to him on cell phone outside of the Republican conference. He was on his cell phone outside the Democratic conference. We both agreed that our conferences were not ready to move on the bill. We both agreed it needed to be done and needed to be done then. And I said, I'll meet you on the floor of the Senate. 2 hours later, it passed. So the Senate, when it wants to, can act. You talk about legislation. One year, we got the senators to leave. Tom Daschle and I passed 47 bills that night by unanimous consent.
Just the two of you.
Just the two of us.
And
we had a grand old time.
Because he did that, we never leave until they turn off the lights.
That's when the good stuff gets done.
So just remember that, again, the Senate is ponderous and all, but when it wants to move fast, it can.
You were talking about change and reform and how it's sometimes it's used too much as if it's a good thing. And I remember Lloyd Cutler, who has since passed away, but he was one who really thought the Cloture rule was unconstitutional. But he would sometimes quote somebody from the British reform debates of the 1800s who got up in the Parliament and said, "Reform, reform, reform. That's all we hear, as if things weren't bad enough already." And I think that's the attitude that some members of the House and the Senate have towards those that might want to drastically alter the way that things are done. But in any event, I think it's time to open things up for questions. Raise your hand, wait for a microphone, and then give your name and affiliation. Not everybody at once. Let's start down here in the front row with this lovely young lady.
Your wife, boy, you're really trying to get some brownie points here.
Can somebody tell me
Name, please, and
Monty Tripp with Wexler and Walker, looking for some background on why the Senate doesn't have any germaneness rules and whether imposing some kind of germaneness.
We're talking about germaneness rule in the Senate?
Yes. Whether that would actually help to move the body.
That was actually one of the things that I occasionally suggested, and probably what made Senator Byrd mad at me. One of the difficult things in the Senate, or one of the good things in the Senate, is you can wander out there on any bill at any time and offer any amendments you want to, whether it's germane, relevant, related, paid for, or anything. Now, if it's under the pay-go rules, if you have those, theoretically, somebody might object. You might have a point of order on budget, all that sort of stuff, but that's what really makes it difficult to produce good legislation, and it's really what makes it difficult for the leadership, Democrat or Republican, because you don't know what's going to pop up out there. And that's one reason why these gentlemen's agreements between the leaders do matter. Quite often, to wrap up a bill, I used to complain to Harry Reid when he was whip and I was in the leadership position. Every time I'd call a bill, 100 Democrat amendments would pop up. 100. Usually the same amendments, but boom, there they were. I had 100 amendments sitting there, and I'd go to Harry and say, Harry, we're going to get these appropriations bills done, and, we're going to have to move these things. Help me. And there were a bunch of Republicans, and then he'd go out, and he'd come back in a little while, and he'd say, I got it down to 38 amendments. And I said, well, I got 8 over here on my side, and I'll show you mine, and you show me yours. No ugly intention involved there. But so when I'd show him my 8, they would be hair-pulling amendments that they did not want to vote on. And, he'd have his 38, some I wouldn't want to vote on. Next thing you know, we would accept 17 by unanimous consent. We'd get down to vote on 7 or 8 amendments. And so we'd clean the deck of all these non-germane, irrelevant amendments. But again, as much as I hated it in many cases, I would not change it. That is the Senate. This is the unique character and nature of the Senate and the rights of the senators and the power of the individual senators. Sure, sometimes you get so mad that one, senator wanders in and balls up the whole Senate. And it doesn't take a freshman senator long to figure out that he or she can do that. But it tends to work itself out when you give it the appropriate attention. How about it, historian?
The very first rules of the Senate, and then reaffirmed by Thomas Jefferson's Manual of Parliamentary Procedure, published in 1801, said that debate is not to be tedious or beside the point. Basically, that's been interpreted to mean debate is to be germane. And as Senator Lott points out, that lasted all of about 5 seconds. Because, how do you define germaneness? And how do you force a senator to sit down by saying, sorry, you're not speaking on the point? And the senators would always say, I am speaking on the point if you just give me a chance to get to my point. It may take a while to get there, but we'll do it. So germaneness kind of, in terms of debate, kind of went down the drain pretty early in the Senate's history. So.
Okay. Other questions? Let's go to Rick Beth there, yes.
I'm Rick Beth. I'm with the Congressional Research Service, and I wanted to ask maybe anyone on the panel, there's something that has concerned me for a long time about the attempt to control the holds process, and that is that as long as you've got the threat of a filibuster, then it seems to me the leadership has to pay attention to a notification that somebody is going to be willing to filibuster something, whether he follows the rules and makes it public or doesn't follow the rules and leaves it secret. And in fact, if there's a rule that says, well, you have to give notice of a hold and it has to be public, well, then he doesn't actually, he says, well, this isn't really a hold, but, or as a staffer friend of mine put it, all he has to say is, this is a nice little nomination you got here. It'd be a shame if anything happened to it. So how are you going to be able to control holds without controlling the filibuster? And if I can have a second one of a rather different kind, I always wanted to ask Senator Lott, because the media accounts I've read indicate that he might have been the originator of the description of the nuclear option. And I wanted to know if he could say what it is about the nuclear option that he thinks makes it nuclear.
Okay, on holds.
First of all, we better explain to our TV audience what a hold is.
A hold is where a senator notifies the leader or his leadership that he or she wishes to be notified when this amendment or this bill is going to be brought up or this nominee, so that he or she could come over and discuss the issue or the nominee at length. This is the leader's greatest nightmare. And Harry Reid, quite often Harry'd have to deal, I'm sure, has to deal with a Democrat threatening a hold. Now, I had it on my side, and every now the problem is the one thing that the leader in the Senate does not have is time. And by the way, I think it's the toughest job in that city. That's why I withhold public criticism of Harry Reid, because I know he's got the toughest job in the city. President makes a decision, thousands of people in the executive branch move. In the House, Speaker Boehner or Speaker Pelosi, they have the Rules Committee. And if you control the Rules Committee, you control the place. And when the Speaker makes a decision, the Chairman of the Rules Committee, acts on it, controls time and what amendments can be offered. The leader in the House and the Senate does not have that. It's not a constitutional position. You run the Senate by by tradition and respect for the position, if not for the person themselves. So, it is a very difficult job, and holds just stop the place. But one of the things, if you have the luxury of time, you can break it. And what I used to do every now and then, if I'd have some Republican that'd send word over by a staff member, and I quite often would find out it wasn't a senator, it was a staff member. That is one of the problems in the Senate. Said they wanted to hold, they wanted to debate it. I'd say, tell them come over here and debate it. Get on over here right now. I'm waiting in the cloakroom for them. We're going, they're going to have to take the floor and debate it. It's amazing how many times that hold would disappear, because it was quite often at 5:30 or 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock at night, and I was saying, okay, get over here. You're going to have to do it. Now, at the end of a session, you don't have that luxury. One time, I got tangled up with Senator Kennedy, and in the Senate, when Senator Kennedy was there, if you're going to take him on, you better bring your lunch, because it was going to be a long time. And one of the changes they made this year is one that he invoked. But it was the end of the session in 1996, and it was a labor issue, and it was going to change the labor provision, and he was going to block it. And the staff lady that was our floor director said, "Well, you can't do it because he's going to block it." I said, "Why can't I do it?" She said, "Because he'll have 7 cloture motions. It'll take us days to break it." And I said, "Well, I don't care. We're going to do it." I actually wound up keeping the Senate there an extra week over this one issue. And step one that he took, and this was like on a Thursday night, he demanded that the bill be read. And didn't they just have some reform on that?
Right. They got rid of that
in
the Senate if it's available 72 hours in advance.
He could not have done that objection if under this new rule. And so I said, "Tell him to start reading." So I went down to the dining room to get something to eat. As Janet remembers, I tried to make the Senate a decent place to live and work, and it was very hard to do. But at 20 minutes till 9, the word came to the dining room that Senator Kennedy had said that he would not, do that, but he would invoke his rule, which forced me to keep it over another day. And I wound up going from Thursday to Thursday to break his objections, his holds. And the final vote, by the way, was 98 to 2.
Right.
98 to 2. So, but the leaders don't have a week to break a hold. Ordinarily, you have to be a really obstinate, hard-headed, bull-headed leader and determined, and you have to have a cooperative conference to do that. On the nuclear option, I have been blamed, maybe even, I don't know who came up with it, but apparently somebody found that the first time the term nuclear option was used with regard to confirmation or filibusters of Supreme Court justices, I must have done it because I got attribution for it. And the term was, and I embellished it as time went along, like I was wont to do, was that if you did it, it would blow the place up. If you enforced that vote and had the vote, and at one point we had the vote to invoke the nuclear option. We had 51 votes. But
that depended on what a ruling from the chair that you, by majority vote, could change the rules in essence and get rid of the filibuster.
Right, and I had a few problems with the parliamentarian too, as you recall. But,
I recall that.
But at any rate, blow the place up. But here's the thing you need to understand about that. I really didn't want the nuclear option. I really didn't think that they should filibuster a Supreme Court justice, but. And he may deny it, but the person that came up with the solution was Lamar Alexander. And then there was this side group created called the Gang of 14, which I was flirting with, but I could not, at that time, I couldn't be in the group because it looked like I was undermining the then majority leader. So I went to John McCain and said, "John, I can't be in the middle of this, so we need you to go into it and to work out the language and enforce this solution," which was the Gang of 14 solution. A few in the media recall and know, and it can be confirmed by Susan Collins, was that I was involved not only in the term nuclear option, but in the solution that avoided the nuclear option from being employed. So that's the kind of thing, the Senate, you have to do. Sometimes you have to set up a straw man, and then you have to find a way to knock it down so the Senate then can act. Does that make any sense?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure it answers the question fully, but it does make sense.
Let's go to John Kingdon here.
I'm John Kingdon from the University of Michigan. I think someone ought to be more critical of the Senate than you all have been, so I'll do it.
Go ahead,
John. John Fortier said that the public has a dim view of the Congress. Actually, it's true that mostly the public opinion, the survey questions are asked about the Congress, but mostly they're unhappy about the Senate. I mean, the House actually does its business. They send bills over to the Senate. Last year they sent 400 that the Senate never acted on. It wasn't just that they voted down those bills. They never even acted on them. They didn't pass appropriation bills, and so on. Now, I heard that kind of criticism from House members back in the 1960s when I was interviewing House members, but I think they would say that it's gotten a lot worse. Senator Lott, you said that the Senate was composed of 100 egomaniacs, and you said that was, and that you were...
I included myself.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I take that more seriously. I actually think that that's a really big problem for the Senate. Mostly senators get there because they know it's a place that they can individually throw the weight around, as opposed to having an institution that's actually going to accomplish something. I mean, your story about Kennedy holding up the Senate for a week and then eventually the thing passes 98-2. Most observers looking at that would say, that's a ridiculous way to do business. That's ridiculous. And the reason that I wanted to say something about this is that I think this has gotten to the point where it's beyond the filibuster, it's beyond dysfunctional. I think it's dangerous to the country. It is dangerous when the public gets this angry. I think it's really perilous.
Thank you. Let me, before anybody else responds, let me just quote from an excellent book, which I highly recommend, called Herding Cats, A Life in Politics by Trent Lott. But this is, he started out at the beginning when he first got to the Senate, saying the Senate was the most frustrating place I'd ever been in my life. The process was glacial, messy, and unpredictable. All I could do was go along, get along, and start making lists of things that I would change in the Senate when I had the opportunity. And then at the end of the book, this is after you've stepped down as majority leader and you're about to go on the Rules Committee as chair and maybe look at some of these rules, which you said needed looking at. You said the Senate, in my judgment, had become increasingly dysfunctional. Some people argue that it had always been that way, but the gridlock has plainly worsened over the years. As a body, we've become so muscle-bound with such rules and rights that the Senate has become almost impossible to manage. That's what I think herding cats means, doesn't it? You used to use another metaphor, I think, about bullfrogs.
Yeah.
What did you say?
I said, dealing with the Senate's like trying to keep bullfrogs in a wheelbarrow. You get them in there, and then you get two in, and one jumps out, and you just can't keep them in there. They keep jumping out. And that's one thing about senators. These are pretty experienced hands. A lot of them don't come there just to throw the weight around. A lot of them come there with, high goals for their country and what they want to do. But once they get there, they do realize the rules power the individual senator so much. I didn't realize how much that was true until I got over there. But also with senators, a lot of these senators have been congressmen, governors. They're old. They're a little older than the House. They're more experienced, and you can't pin them down. I was the whip in the House and the whip in the Senate. And when I was, the whip for 196 Republicans, it was easier to count those 196 and count on them staying where they told you they was going to be than to count 46 senators and count on them being, because, first of all, you couldn't force them to make a decision because they were smart enough to know, no, I'm not going to tell you until I see the whites of your eyes and realize I'm going to have to vote. So pushing them to give you an answer was hard enough. Plus, sometimes circumstances changed, constituencies had a different demand, and they wouldn't stay in the barrel. They'd get out from where you thought they were going to be, and they'd jump out and be in another position. Go ahead.
Can I comment a little bit about, kind of the frustration that voters feel about the Senate in particular, but I think it does also apply to the House, that I think is really different and opens up potential for a different kind of pressure for reform, which is I am astonished at how much more people know now about the gory details of what's going on in Congress. I mean, the internet and, online access to information, and it's easier to watch stuff, committee hearings and roll call votes. I mean, people are really much more aware because, before the Senate was on television, who knew? And when it was all done in a closed-door room. So, whatever the pathologies of the institution are, I think they're out there a lot more. And I had a couple of really, it's been kind of evolving, but I had a couple of recent examples that really brought it home to me because I was talking to some House Republicans about the influence of the Tea Party, which is so, they kind of were very involved in the election. I'm wondering how much they communicate with members as they're governing as opposed to when they're campaigning. And one of them said, well, I was very heavily lobbied by Tea Party people on our decision about committee chairman. Now, committee chairman was like the inside baseball of all inside baseball, but it really did make a big difference who was going to be chairman of the Appropriations Committee, was it going to be a good old boy? Now, in the end, I don't know how much lobbying mattered in that.
And energy and commerce.
Energy and commerce.
Oh, yeah.
But just the fact that people were aware of that, I think the institution's more transparent and more subject to people's whims. not whims. They're sort of their opinions and their ability to express what they think. And the second example was really striking. After when the House was voting on the continuing resolution, it cut like $60 billion, and which was a lot of money. All the Democrats opposed it, but there were some conservative Republicans that wanted to cut another $20 billion, and it was sponsored by the Republican Study Committee. And the amendment to cut more went down. But it went down because 92 Republicans voted against this additional cut. So it was an interesting vote, and right after they passed it, they went out onto their town hall meetings for their August recess, or not August recess, whatever it was, winter recess. And a bunch of members reported to me that people showed up at their town hall meetings knowing that 92 Republicans had voted against this amendment. And they knew whether their member of Congress voted for or against that amendment. And that was information that was spread very rapidly. And, this is accountability. This is voters going home and, So, I don't know. I just think it's good that people know more about how Congress is working, what it's doing, what it's not doing. And so I don't know whether that creates another force for change or on the filibuster or anything else. But I guess I believe more information is good.
Go ahead. Pick up on that point. Yeah. In furtherance of what you were saying, I was talking to just a good old boy, a retired school teacher in a congressional district in my state recently, and they've got a new member of Congress, and they had those 500 votes, and he observed that how this new congressman had cast 7 votes against what was the Tea Party and the leadership position. I mean, he knew that this individual congressman had voted 7 times against the wishes of somebody. I was staggered that this guy, but he's sitting there and they actually watch C-SPAN, they watch Fox or MSNBC, and they keep up with what these congressmen and senators are doing. I guess that's good. It's a little surprising and scary if you're the congressman.
Can I add a couple of things? One, I think you're absolutely right. The number of people who watch this has grown, but it's still a relatively limited public, right? It's an activist, informed public. It doesn't expand as widely into the electorate. The average voter still doesn't really know what's going on in Congress. But more generally, I think I'm glad you brought up the question, because I think you're right. This panel does not reflect what was a very strong anger against the Senate. I mean, my point was that the Senate is now bearing the full brunt of what might have been addressed at parts of the House or the party system before. That Senate is in some ways the last thing keeping dedicated majorities from getting what they want. The other question to ask, though, is it really is whether you want a kind of full system of party government or whether you want a kind of hybrid system that we have, and whether you like the polarization. I mean, there are many ways in which people do like the polarization and the clarity of ideas and the ability of a party to come in and put their stamp on things. But the Senate does, if you think of a simple point of a football field, the way the House acts, it's not so much that the House has to please its most, the Democratic side of it, its most conservative member to get something through. It often there's a kind of enforcement of party discipline in the House that didn't exist when the caucus was much more disparate. And so the majority decision coming out of the House of Representatives is more likely to be somewhere on the 25 or 30-yard line of the political spectrum than it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. And if we switch parties, we switch the whole president, House, and Senate to the other side, if we had a more parliamentary system, you could expect it to shift more to the 25 or 30-yard line of the other side. The Senate, if it works, does tend to force you to go out and get somewhere in the 40 to 50-yard line. Now, maybe the parties are too far apart, and trying to get that one member from the other party means you have to go so far that you think you've compromised your principles. But a danger in following that party government line too far down the road is we're going to have relatively more left and right control of government and big swings, whereas there is a kind of consensus that makes you move a little bit to the middle, and the Senate performs that role.
I was just thinking when you brought that question up, John, about John Hibbing and Elizabeth Tice Morris' book, Congress's Public Enemy, where they were sort of operating under the assumption that, well, if people knew more about the Congress, how it really operates, what the process is, and so on, they would understand it more and they would tend to support it more. And they found just the opposite in their polling. Instead of to know them is to love them, they found out that familiarity breeds contempt, and that was sort of the conclusion that they came to. So it's kind of an interesting point, I think.
If I could, now this could spark a debate, so I don't mean to be doing that, but I would maintain that the people were every bit as mad, or maybe madder, at the House, and the proof is in the pudding. They changed the majority in the House. They didn't quite get it done in the Senate. And I'm just so thankful that the Senate didn't pass all that garbage the House was sending over over the last 2 years. But
how many post offices weren't named as a result of that?
I know
what
that.
I want to know.
But just so that I will, picking up on what he read in my book, I do think that the Senate, part of their problem is they are muscle bound. You have to pass, supposedly, a budget every year, although they didn't pass one last year. You have to pass every appropriations bill every year. A lot of authorization bills are one-year authorization bills, defense being Exhibit A. I was always an advocate of biennial budgeting. I think, you could do it a lot of different ways, but budget 1 year and appropriate the next year, but do them for 2 years. And I'm for multi-year authorizations, 5 years, 7 years. So that the organization, the entity that you're authorizing, a committee or a department or agency, knows what their rules are for, 2, 3, 5 years. So I do think that I had there's a term, if you're into horses, it's called a string halter. It's a horse that has that's so muscular that he'll jerk his leg and he can't do what he needs to do. That's what the Senate has become. It is muscle bound. It's got too much. And they need to, the only way you're going to get appropriations bills is the leader has to make a decision, hopefully with the cooperation of the minority leader, to do nothing but appropriations for at least half of May and all of June. Otherwise, you'll never get it done. The last time we got every appropriations bill done before the end of the year, the fiscal year? 1996. We did it in 1996, I believe, or maybe. But it was because we made a conscious decision. We're going to get these things done. And by the way, if you go back and look at the record, that year the Congress adjourned October the 4th, but for the year. And that year, the days in session, I mentioned this, was only 132. And yet, if you study what happened in a year, it was, I mentioned, safe drinking water, portability of insurance, every appropriations bills, a budget, balanced budget, tax cuts, welfare reform, all in that year. And as a matter of fact, over the last 20 years, that is the fewest number of days, with one exception, 132 days over the last 20 years, and yet it was one of the most productive sessions. But it takes the leader just has to say, all right, we're going to do this and we're not going to do anything else, and you have to really push the envelope, and it takes cooperation from the other side of the aisle. One other thing, just so I'll admit complicity, I filed 82 cloture motions in 1995-96 bracket there. Only 50 actually had votes on the cloture, and only cloture to stop the filibuster only succeeded 9 times. But I kept chipping away at it, and by 2001-2002 bracket, we had moved cloture, actually stopping a filibuster, moved it up to over half. 61 cloture votes, 34 succeeded. So it can be done. But it takes focus and determination, particularly in the Senate. It needs some reform, and just to allow them to be able to get the job done.
You're going to get the Phi Slam Jam Award for that number, I think.
Is that right? Okay. Yeah.
Well, with that, we have come to the bewitching hour of 6, but I do want you to join us in the atrium outside for toothpicks and standing up and having some bites and some wine. But please join me in thanking our panel.